So welcome everyone, it's great to see you all here. Thank you all for coming. As Pádraig was saying, the ARINS project seeks to research many things, but one of them is what it calls the diverse identities and traditions on the island of Ireland and how they're understood, felt and expressed. And so in this series of interviews we're hearing from people who have unique perspectives and experiences which help us think about that idea of identities and traditions on the island and how those might intersect with the future politics of the island. And to that end, I'm delighted to have Ben Lowry here with us. Ben will be known to many of you, but just to summarise his career so far, he's currently editor of the Belfast Newsletter, as we know, the world's oldest English language daily newspaper. And he's been editor since 2021, after 8 years as deputy editor. Prior to that, he was news editor at the Newsletter. Ben worked as a journalist for the Belfast Telegraph from 2000 to 2007 and previously at News International in London on the websites of The Sun and The Times. Ben was born in the United States. He grew up in Northern Ireland and qualified as a barrister in London in the 1990s. And many of us will be familiar with Ben as a commentator on Northern politics, and particularly, in a sense, a spokesperson for unionist politics, coming from the kind of newsletters perspective. One of the things then we'd like to do today with Ben is to give him a chance to talk for himself and for his own position and his own sense of who he is and what his unionism represents, and not so much necessarily speaking of as in his professional role, but as a person. But we're going to run through some of the issues which will bring us up, I think, to contemporary politics towards the end. And we're going to leave some time for questions. I know we've a very distinguished audience here. People will have lots of questions for Ben, so we'll leave plenty of time at the end. So Ben, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Can we start with a very general sense of your identity, and even, I suppose, whether that term identity is actually a useful thing for you to think about who you are and what your everyday life is like in your politics?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you all. Identity is it's a very good question to start with because I'm in my 50s now and I have been thinking about my identity and thinking about how I answer in the census. And the way I do answer in the census would be British and Northern Irish. But over the years, I've thought of lots of identities, and I always want to qualify the Irish. Might be Protestant Irish, although I'm not particularly religious, so I'm not that comfortable with that. Might be Scots-Irish, wasn't even a term I was aware of growing up, but the more I understand that's where I fit into the world. But those would be my identities in terms of labels. One of the things about being British, there's a lot of things about Britain that I've come to really appreciate as an adult, and I think they apply to Ireland, by which I mean the Republic of Ireland as well, to a significant extent. Unlike France and unlike America, patriotism isn't right up there. There isn't a lot of flags. I was born in America, and I think it's wonderful that they fly the flag, by the way, and it's amazing the diverse number of places where they fly the flag. But it wouldn't really work in Britain or Ireland. I mean, I know there is a lot of flag flying in Northern Ireland as a way of marking territory. It's just not the way the countries have evolved, and I'm quite comfortable about that. And there's a lot of things about Britain that I have, as an adult, come to be comfortable about and appreciate. And the last thing I'd say in answer to your first question is I was asked once on radio about what the benefits of being British, and they're actually quite hard to identify, as I think with any country. And you're starting to answer in terms of really feeble answers like road signs and stuff, or what makes you feel British. So it's very hard to explain how you come to these things. And the only reason I think about it in depth a lot is because I'm in a job where I am in situations like this and having to explain myself and having to explain my readers. And that's why I say that.
And there's a link between something that's very difficult to explain and a very specific politics. So when you think about your unionism, which may in some ways be exactly the same as or slightly different than your Britishness, where does that come from? So when you think back in your childhood, is it something does it build up over childhood years? When you look back at your parents and yourself in school and so on, do you are you able to analyze and see that from back then where those elements start to build up in your sense of yourself?
Yeah, and that's a good question as well. And stop me if I go on too long in answer to these, because first of all, first thing to say about my parents is, again, this is something I actually didn't look into until my 40s. So we all know, I think, if we can identify 4 grandparents' maiden names and surnames, so I knew that from childhood. But only in my 40s did I say, well, wait a minute, what were the surnames, the maiden names, the 8 names of my great grandparents? And they're very Scottish. Names like Ferguson and Henderson and Wilson and Lowry and Blair and so on. And I hadn't even realized that about myself. I mean, this is incredible. I'm a journalist. I've been interested in politics since I was 12, and I hadn't even figured that out about myself. So that's the first thing I'd say. I found out that I was basically a Scot. I grew up in a house, by the way, in Bangor in Northern Ireland, where on a clear day you could see Scotland. I said this at a Sinn Féin event, and I wasn't trying to curry favour. It is genuinely the case that I grew up in a house that was overlooking Scotland, and I didn't therefore feel Scottish. What I actually wanted was as a boy, an All-Ireland football team, because I thought it would be more able to, a larger number of numbers, to defeat something like Scotland. So how did I get to my identity? Another thing that I value about my upbringing is my parents didn't push any identity on us. And a lot of my politics has come, and a lot of my defense of unionism is the ways in which unionism is maligned. Unionism is maligned in many respects justifiably because it can behave stupidly, but in others not, and doesn't defend itself. And one thing that, for example, in my background, growing up in Northdown, a significantly irreligious part of Northern Ireland, very secular on the whole, I didn't know whether I was Catholic or Protestant until I read it myself. My parents never told me this. And this was a very common experience in somewhere like Northdown. And I didn't understand why our neighbours in Bangor our very close friends, were going to see the Pope in 1979. And I didn't understand until years later. I knew it was a different church, but there's loads of churches. I didn't understand the real significance of that until much later. My parents were very liberal, sort of alliance party types. And I ended up having significantly more unionist politics than my parents. So I valued the fact that wasn't impressed upon me in any way. But again, the more I've read into it and observed and watched things, there are things about the community that I grew up in, unionist, long time before I've been comfortable using a term as simplistic as unionist, but I do. And a real, not only a liking of it, but a real disliking of the maligning.
We're almost the same generation, not quite. And I grew up about maybe 10 miles away from where you were. When I look back on my own, I suppose teenage years in particular, and secondary school, I see then the ways in which I went to Protestant secondary school, and in ways in which a kind of sense of Britishness was around and then almost taught in a way through the curriculum, but also through a series of, I guess, the responses of teachers. One that I particularly remember doing A-level geography was a geography teacher who delighted in, when we studied the European Union, of showing us the poverty statistics in the European Union, with the UK at the top and Greece and Ireland at the bottom. And he would go through this, find about 3 different sets of statistics and linger over the bottom of the table. And when I look back on it now, I realise that it wasn't as if it was explicit, but we were being taught something at that point. We were also being taught things that were counter to that. So when you look back on your education, and obviously at home then, you weren't necessarily even able to coordinate from your home life the world outside. Does school play a role? And I guess there's a bigger question then of your own thoughts on education in the North. And the future of that, we might think about that a little bit too.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So my parents, how did I get born in America? I probably should briefly explain that. My parents were doctors. I qualified in the 1960s. A lot of doctors went out to America, as they did. One of my brothers was born in Northern Ireland. Two of my other brother and I were born in America, and then they came back. My dad came back for an academic position. the Troubles was still significant in 1974. Maybe I'll touch on why he did that, because again, only in my 40s did I say, wait a minute, why did you come back in 74? They were happy to leave, and they had a very good life in America, and things would have turned out differently. I think I'm very shaped by my education. I went to lucky to go to a prep school of a grammar school. You don't have grammar schools academic selection in Northern Ireland, and I think we were pretty well taught, and we were taught fairly traditionally sort of British history, and I, as a child, wanted to know more about local history. And then, this is very significant, again, it shaped my politics and the scale of Irish nationalism and the feeble response of unionism. They did something called GCSEs in Northern Ireland, and they were introduced in the UK, introduced in 1988 when I was 16. We were the first year to do them. So it was a big move away from traditional education. Long story short, I did the pre-run of that at Sullivan. This was the school that I'm talking about, and was the first movement towards anti-unionist history. And then I moved to a school it was called Campbell, but it was modelled itself on a boarding school, on an English boarding school, which was much more British, by the way. It wasn't rammed down your throat, but it was, much more modelled on a British system. And then I did the full GCSE, and they had a mixture of Oxford and Cambridge board exams, which were very British. Not in a jingoistic way, it just wouldn't even occur to Oxford and Cambridge board to be anything other than British history, but Northern Ireland board. And so the Northern Ireland board that we were taught in GCSE history, I remember the book vividly, with a degree of irritation, and I'd like to find it down and expose it as a disgraceful piece of bias. And it made me very pro-Irish nationalist. I won't go into the details of the book unless I've got more time later. But and I just thought, this is outrageous. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this is what I was taught in two of the most British, particularly in the latter school, two of the most British schools in Northern Ireland. So that did shape my history, although maybe not in the way that you would expect. And this is the thing, to this day, I've talked to history teachers, there's not a pushback on a lot of this history that I feel that there should be. So generally, these were schools that helped shape me. Neither school indoctrinated me in British history, and the only thing that approaching indoctrination I got was the history that I very vividly remember, which was, I will tell you a bit about this book because it's not fair to say, chapters on gerrymandering, chapters on rent, bad allocation, chapters on Ian Paisley's bigotry. Then a chapter on Bloody Sunday, I remember that. Then when it moved into the atrocities, it was a mixture of IRA and so on. Well, hold on a minute. If we're going to start looking into statistics, 60% of the deaths in Northern Ireland were Republican terrorist deaths. 10% were state killings, most of them legal. So immediately there were distortions, and I wasn't taught that. So for a while, I considered myself an Irish. I was very left-wing, briefly, in sort of 16, 17 age, left-wing, pro-Irish nationalist and so on. And then it's been a gradual, long journey through my own reading and observation away from that.
That's really interesting. My 18-year-old would be delighted to hear this because I asked him what I should ask you, and he's doing history as one of his final subjects in school and wants to be a politician. And he said, ask him about obstructionism and the history of unionism. So he'd be delighted to know that once upon a time you saw. I think you see things in a particular way when you're that age. So when your peers then. You have a set of peers from that time. Have their politics gone in parallel with yours? Yeah,
that's another great question. So no, in defense, well, actually, one thing I'm beginning, things do fluctuate. So first of all, most of the people that I remember from school, there's 4 guys I'm very good friends with from school, and they're don't want to say apolitical because they're smart guys, not as political as me, and I think all anti-Brexit and annoyed by Brexit is, I think, would be fair to say, yeah, and maybe have been pushed away. I see perhaps in many such people a sort of, well, hold on a minute, going on. You know, when they're seeing soldiers put in the docks and IRA terrorist leaders enjoying a de facto amnesty and so on. So I think it's moving, in answer to your question. So I'm very atypical from my friends because, first of all, I'm far more interested in politics. By the way, when I was at this minor public school or model in a public school, I got The Guardian every day, which was unheard of. But I found that the school was great. They thought it was eccentric. Some of the other boys would pick it up and read the sports section, but very understanding. So I think there was this movement away from I don't want to say Britishness, unionism, whatever, after the Brexit vote. And I think that maybe there could yet be something of a pushback the other way if things go too far.
Is that a pushback towards Britishness or towards a sense of unionism maybe in the North as in and of its own identity, rather than necessarily a connection to Britain? I think
what it is an awareness, a sort of, even amongst apolitical people, even amongst people who aren't that unionist, even amongst, when they see a lot of things happening, and I think a lot of things are happening now, I think there's a very triumphant and aggressive nationalism on the island. Look at this ooh-ah up the Raz stuff and so on. I think it's more a sense of, well, wait a minute, we, the community, we weren't that bad. You know, I think there's maybe a feeling of that emerging.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of those issues about the connection with Britain and the post-Brexit Britain in a minute, but I'm interested in I've never heard you talk before about, I've heard you talk about the history of the Troubles, obviously, and the way that you see that as very skewed. But the prehistory, before the Troubles, when you think about that now, the kind of 100 years rather than 40 years or 50 years, it's a curiosity to me, having grown up in the same community that's called as you. I could never quite understand how I was meant to think of the pre-Troubles Northern Ireland as a unionist, to understand what it was. I knew why it was there. At least I know now why it was there. But it was never really a feature. It was as if it had kind of existed back into some shadowy time. There was never a sense of Northern Ireland being a constructed place, but a perpetual place. So when you look at that pre-Troubles history, is that important to you as a time?
Yeah, so, let me answer by going back 300 to 400 years, and let me do that by briefly talking to you a little bit about the newsletter. We are the oldest English language daily newspaper in the world, 1737. Now, that's a fluke. You know, the difference between us, there were loads of newspapers then, they were kind of emerging all over the place, is that we survived. So I believe there was a Dublin newsletter. I used to have this information. There was. I can't remember exactly when. There was certainly a Boston newsletter, founded, I think, by Benjamin Franklin's brother. So there were a lot of papers like that at the time. By a series of flukes, we survived. So again, this is something I only really found out in my 40s, was a better understanding of the society that was the precursor to Northern Ireland, which is the Ulster post-plantation. So where I would be sympathetic to Irish nationalism still, having said that in my teens I was much more generally sympathetic, is there's no question that there's a structural inequality in the... I didn't really understand this until I serialized the newsletters from the beginning. So I'm the only person in the world, I believe, to have done an on this day 275 years ago and on this day 280 years ago column. And the reason I think I'm the only person in the world to have done that, because I don't think there are any daily papers old enough to have done it. Maybe there now are, but there weren't then because we were the oldest. There's one or two in Germany maybe did it. So by that I mean, and to the non-newspaper readers among you, I'm sure you're most of you are familiar with a newspaper saying, on this day 100 years ago. So it has a column which shows you what the paper was reporting 100 years ago. I did that for 275 years ago in 2012, 2013, and 280 years ago, 5 years later, from an intact batch of newsletters from 1738 and 1739. I know them inside out. I've serialized them twice. Second time I did it, I realized there's things I'd missed. Random, incredible stuff. Jonathan Swift is reported as the dean of whichever cathedral it is. I'll embarrass myself by getting it wrong, but that kind of thing. Handel's Messiah would be, if it was 1742, reported by the newsletter, but they're lost. Most of the newsletters from 1737 to 1750s are lost, but there's this intact batch. So what did I find from that batch? Well, first of all, it's very all-island. And it's the further you get from Belfast, the less news there is. So Dublin, there's a fair amount of news from, but it's a bit like Glasgow. So it's not a northern thing because there's no concept in Northern Ireland. In fact, the word Ulster barely appears. Does appear, but barely appears. But one of the things that if I'm honest about it, I was not in matter of being honest about it, it's very obvious. It's very, there's a structural inequality against Catholics in 1730s for sure. They don't really exist in a visible way. There's barely any Gaelic names. You'll occasionally get an official called O'Neill or something. And it's very stable, probably through complete suppression. There's one or two incidents that might seem to be sectarian. There's somebody stabbed a doorman and security man in Dublin. Barely anything. It's the most incredible thing. So what do I deduce from that? Well, I think that there's a structural inequality for Protestants, obviously, from the plantation right up until probably the present day. If you really grind into wealth levels, you might find the tiniest fraction of Protestant advantage. But it would be so, and that's because, like white people in America or whatever it might be, which is far more entrenched a privilege, by the way, it takes centuries for these to disappear. So what do I also see? And just very quick, because I don't want to take too long on this. You go from 1730s newsletter, and it's a very hidebound society, and everything, even houses to let, are ultimately owned by aristocrats. And sorry, I really want to say this because this is an audience that might appreciate this point. I think I'm one of the only people in the world who's traveled forward in time, by which I mean this. I was absorbed in 1738 and 1739 for months, really thinking about it, thinking about Dublin, thinking about the society, I never got to the bottom of how they travelled between Belfast and Dublin. There's a reference to a chair going. And then one day, I went over to the Linen Hall to check our paper, I was thinking in the 1730s, it was as if I lived there. I think it was the second time I'd done it, so I'd done this before. And I suddenly saw a 1786 paper on display at the Linen Hall. And it was like I was punched in the stomach. I went, oh my God, that's so modern. Because I'd been in the 1730s for months. So if I had seen these two papers side by side a year or 10 years before, I'd have just thought they're really old and one day I'll read them, and I probably never would. But when I'd seen them, I saw the advances in the early papers of dancing lessons, the later papers of violin lessons and so on. Why do I tell you all that? I tell you all that because the society becomes radically richer in the 1780s. So you see in Northern Ireland, there's reference to a dining club in Hillsborough. There's nothing like that in the 1730s. So I see, and it all makes sense. Suddenly, well, of course I knew all this anyway, but really made sense. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the attempted Irish Revolution in the 1790s. So the society became a lot richer and people's expectations were up. I won't go on and on and on about how I also can see pre-Act of Union, post-Act of Union. I consider the Act of Union to be perhaps an accidental success. I believe that the architects were a bit disappointed with it, but I see the changes as a newspaper man when I look at papers from the 1830s. To come to the 1900s and say about Northern Ireland, I think it was a profoundly flawed society, but a wonderful civilization. And we've just lost track of the civilization. I have seen emerging over, plantation was a dreadful thing, as was the plantation of the US at the same time. These were brutal times. They happened in places. But they created a very civilized society. We went our different ways in the 1900s, and now I don't pretend to have a good understanding. a considered or meaningful understanding of post-Troubles Northern Ireland, because I didn't really think about it until well into adulthood. But now when I look at that society, a very good, an advanced society, which is the cardinal sin was a degree of sectarianism, nothing like as bad as said, at a time when there was a lot of sectarianism on both sides of the divide, and a complacency. The complacency of a privileged community that led to its ruin, ultimately. That the privileged community, aside from the wrongs, and there were people who suffered, terrible people died and all sorts of things happened. I'm not downplaying that. I'm just saying if you look at it dispassionately as I do. And another thing that another final theory I've come to think about the pre-Troubles Northern Ireland, I think post-1945, there was a gratitude in London and in Washington towards Northern Ireland. Didn't think about it. You had Eisenhower and people there. He passed through Northern Ireland, having been part of the war effort, so that they kind of left it alone. And that led to the stupid stuff you saw. So you still had a pretty well-run, good civil service society, very well-run in many respects, but by God, there was a complacency, and there was a failure to tackle sectarianism, and a failure to realize how fast the Catholic middle class was rising, and the danger of that. Increasing wealth being like this, but 1900 to 1950s like this, 60s like this, but the expectations were up to the sky. And that's how it erupts in violence.
Mm. And is there a value in contemporary unionism, going back and examining that, what you call complacency? It might be, a lot of people say it's a very soft term for the Northern Irish state between 1920s and the 1960s.
And this is where I'd be really critical of unionists. Not only is there a value to it, I just couldn't believe it. The Scottish vote, there was no interest in it until the last few weeks when it looked like the 2014 independence vote, a decade ago, gosh. No interest until the last few weeks when it suddenly seemed they might go. And that's stupidity. I mean, damn it. Are you not thinking about this? And we tried to, generate some interest in the paper. And then Brexit. No real thinking about it. No real thinking about the perils. No real, it would have been like Gibraltar. If there'd been proper thinking, Gibraltar was 96% voted to stay? If there'd been a proper thinking. So yes, it's a really big problem with unionism. It not only does it need to happen, and I'm not saying unionists should be apologetic, by the way, because of reasons I've touched on. But yes, you need to think, and you need to think about what your limitations are, and think about what the perils are, and think about complacency.
I just want to talk about maybe some of the other potential aspects of unionism, then we'll come back to some of those issues. So we talked a little bit about history. You said that you don't particularly yourself have a strong sense of religious faith as part of your identity. Is that still the case for you?
I don't want to talk about myself. How
Sure.
I've gone from no, just because it's boring. How I've gone from an atheist to almost a believer. My parents were brought up and had very happy memories of it. My parents died a couple of years ago. Insofar as I talked about it, one was brought up in a Methodist family, brought up in a Presbyterian church, and the other, my dad, brought up in a Methodist church. Both of them never went to church. So two answers to that. The first is, this is another thing that agitated me. When I was at the Belfast Telegraph, when I came back from London, and being sent out as a young reporter to another act of idiocy by Free Presbyterians and so on. And then I wanted to say, well, hold on a minute, why are you sending out, why are you perpetuating the myth of the Bible bashing prod? Why don't we go out and laugh a little bit about Catholics? Do you see, by which I mean this speed with it, oh, look at them, oh, they're opposed to line dancing, oh, there's, Free Presbyterians are 1% of broads at their height, were 1%. That's when they had 10,000, which I doubt they do now. And go to 1968. This is another thing that I found out later in life. Weekly church attendance amongst Anglicans and Presbyterians was already under 50%. I think Methodists were around 50%. Catholics were at 94, 95, 96%. Now, if we are a society, which both sides of the board I think largely is, that thinks secularism is a good thing, as it happens, I'm going in the other direction, but that's another story. But if we are a society of that, then don't laugh about Bible bashing prods. They were decades ahead of Catholics into secularism. laugh about the Catholics who were 94, 95, 96%. Of course, Catholic church attendance has collapsed. Why do I feel a little bit strongly about that? The maligning of unionists, but also that was my experience. I grew up my parents played tennis and golf on Sundays. I grew up in an environment in which nobody went to church. And as I say, I now see an awful lot of merit in going to church apart from anything else, to the ritual. So it's another thing where I'm alive to the misconceptions.
And yet, in our perception of unionism, and possibly in unionist politics itself, faith plays a much larger role than that would suggest.
That's right.
And a particular type of Protestant faith as well, an evangelical,
yes,
post-60s evangelical form of faith.
So I should emphasize in my criticism of the perception of unionism, my goodness, they haven't helped themselves. Do they not even, as Pete Shirlow says, the geographer, do they not even know their own community? Do they not even know this? I mean, they're sort of, like in America, I think the first openly atheist member of Congress was, 10 years ago, relatively recently. I think it was this century. And so unionists not having the confidence. Yes, there was a disproportionate, has and still disproportionate influence of evangelicals in Northern Ireland. Now, to be clear, Northern Ireland's this island is very like America, because you still have very significant levels of Catholic church attendance and very significant levels of Protestant church attendance, probably around 20-25%. Northern Ireland, for all my point about being first into secularism, is not like England, which is as close to an atheist society as you can get. Low single figures amongst people who would be Protestant English church attendance. Much higher levels amongst Muslims, obviously, and I think some evangelical groups from other parts of the world. But so yes, I think that it is. I think we're now maybe finding a balance towards sort of being respectful of a very important tradition on these islands, Catholic and Protestant people of faith, and not being, as unionism was, so grossly overrepresented that for Arlene Foster and I think Jeffrey Donaldson to have been Anglicans was a big deal, and not evangelicals.
So you've talked a little bit about Britishness and how Britishness as a concept is important to you. I hadn't heard you talk about the 17th century work or the 18th century work you've done before, and obviously that's leading up to a very particular moment in the history of the island and in a sense the history of Protestantism around the United Irishmen, and they're trying to think about the kind of anti-monarchical ideals, I suppose, of the French Revolution. So does monarchy, for you, is monarchy part, obviously it's a central part of how unionism ties itself together, but is monarchy an important feature of unionism for your sense of who you are?
It isn't actually for me. And again, these are fascinating questions. I am somebody who's backed into being a pro-monarchy because of the very profound problems that you have, be it with an Irish president or an American president, particularly apparent in American presidents, with a hard-edged political, but also figures who try to be statesmanlike and so on. So actually the monarchy has been a bit of a fluke. The monarchy, in my own journey through it, is always there. Going to London and the great excitement, and joking with my brothers that one of us would say we'd seen the Queen when we drove past Buckingham Palace up at a window and that kind of thing. And then I also, a very early memory of mine was when I was 5 in this house that overlooked Scotland, being on the roof when Royal Yacht Britannia came in. And then I have the atypical admiration for monarchy of having followed them as a reporter for many years and seen the really not very pleasant job that they have, and how they have to be nice to people and how tedious it is. It's amazing they don't snap at people more. They basically never do. And if they do 23 years ago, nobody forgets it. And smiling and laughing their way through unfunny situations or watching boring school plays or whatever. And they have to be, I wouldn't take it for living in a palace. So I've ended up thinking that the monarchical system works well. But in answer to, rather than to depersonalize the implication of your question, I think that that's something that unionists are not quite prepared for, because I do think that the business of singing something like "God Save the King" it's amazing it doesn't seem more silly when people aren't religious, and the idea of God saving anybody and then a hereditary thing. So it's something that works well, but I think the monarchy itself, thank goodness, has the wit to move away from some of the more archaic aspects while retaining the sort of magic of it. But I've never felt particularly monarchical. I think because I'm more political, and I think that, well, okay, we're lucky we've had monarchs lately who people warm to, but what on earth are we going to do? It might be 23 years from now or 123 years. What are we going to do when, as is inevitable with the laws of probability, somebody comes up who just people sense, perhaps accurately, is a rather disagreeable person?
Do you think it's a danger for unionism then? It's not a question about yourself, but more broadly about unionism, in that it configures monarchy as so central to its own sense of what it is, and that the actual monarchy becomes very different to how unionism understands monarchy?
So I really think that the unionism needs to rely upon the entity that is the UK, which is very problematic, by the way, because one of the reasons I imagine that stickers and cars say GB is Grand Britannia, the country that they're most likely to be in is France. So it's something that the immediate nearest country where loads and loads of people drive to, it's understood. But anything like that, like Team GB, is moving away from UK. And the UK is a very, very good entity that unionists should promote and push, and needs to push back about the language. I find myself again and again and again talking about Irish unity. It's very hard to avoid these terms, these lovely, nice, mellifluous terms. Well, hold on a minute. Let's start to change the language about shattering the UK, about Ireland 100 years ago going alone, doing its own precursor to Brexit, going it alone and suffering in the wilderness. And the problems with that, if you're going to sneer about Brexit, I think it's worked really well for Ireland in many respects, but it's still a small country. I mean, after 50 difficult years, first 50 years. And by the way, my first memories of and I don't say this in any way to be flippant, I loved coming to Dublin in the 70s when I started to remember it. Loved having a McDonald's. It was really exciting to go to McDonald's in Grafton Street. But also seeing things like beggars, and it's a dreadful thing to say if I was misconstrued. It just, this is a big city where they've got beggars, and it was, just that's what happens in big cities, like when you read about Calcutta or something. So, but I now realize with hindsight the tail end of the society that I was seeing. And by the way, just a footnote on the Pope. I was because this great friends of ours to this day. They happen to have kids the same age as I'm one of four, as we had. When they went to see the Pope, I always remember the Pope landing, and there were builders in our house, and I remember everybody watching, and he got down off a jumbo jet and kissed the ground. And so jumbo jet, kissing the ground, went to Phoenix Park, 1 million people. I was coming up to 8. I was beginning to have a concept of ideas like 1 million. My dad, a doctor friend of his counterpart in Dublin, who used to visit. I went down with them, and I asked them to take me to Phoenix Park because I couldn't believe this place where there'd been 1 million people. And I remember still there were these white crowd barriers still in place to see all that. Why? I've rambled. What was your question again?
I think it was about the monarchy. I think it was about the distance between unionism and the actual monarchy, how that becomes...
I was going somewhere with that. It's very annoying that I can't finish it.
Well, let me ask you.
I'll come back to
We'll reframe it. So you talked a bit about the values of the UK, I suppose, and it would be interesting to hear you outline those, but also maybe, I think what you're suggesting to us is that you have some kind of sense that the UK, maybe as a constitutional monarchy, maybe through its history, maybe through its parliamentary structures, represents something very important to you. And I can see also that in your work on the 18th century, that you may be tracing some of the lineage of the development of those political ideas. But what about contemporary Britain? I think from our position in Dublin, living in Dublin today, living through Brexit, Some of us will want to say what we're looking at is the collapse of the UK.
Sorry.
But how do you think of the UK now?
I'm very glad that I've remembered where I was going. So what I was saying about the small country thing. So all of the sneering is about Britain and so on. And what about your own movement? We, by the way, ran an essay by John Pruden against the Easter Rising, which was 4,000 words and was very well read. And as it happens, you wouldn't be surprised to find I agree with this analysis of where things would have gone. And I think it actually probably would have been much closer to an all-island, a sort of Canadian style, Australian style. So what my point was about my memories of the early Ireland and what I now realize to be the poverty and the very, very high levels of church-going and so on. And how on earth can unionists not turn any of this round? And challenge these terms like Irish unity and inevitability. And unionists, this is something, and why I'm very glad to speak in environments like this. Unionists, have you noticed how unionists and how they go along with it themselves often to apologize and start to talk about their Irishness? The subtext is apology. We don't expect this from Irish people. We don't, on both sides of the border, to start talking about their Britishness and warmly. So there's this, and that's what I was opposing. That was the direction without looking at the difficulties in the route that the independent Ireland went on, and that is the point about that. But with regard to the monarchy, I think that monarchies survive to an astonishing extent. The UK is a system that works very well. And in answer to your clarified question, central to me, and it must be to people who are much less political than me is the political system, right? That's really big, that you're plugged into voting in these Westminster general elections. So if I was to grind into the really small things that are important to being British, I would say things like shared experiences in wars. There haven't been any for a while. Maybe there will be again. Hope not. But an awareness, sort of thinking about where things is. BBC, absolutely central. The programs you're watching, the shared experience the next day at school and so on. And still to an extent, even though people watch in different ways. Yes, the monarchy as a third. And then fourth is going to be the shared politics. Actually, I would be moving on to other things, a very big part of it. And I say this as somebody whose brother went to Trinity, and I would very seriously have considered going to Trinity myself if my brother hadn't gone. I wanted to go somewhere other than Northern Ireland. I went to University of Sussex, being plugged into this university network.
And then I suppose when we look at Brexit from a perspective in the Republic and look at unionism and how it played Brexit, clearly it played it quite badly. But structurally within the kind of identities that were in play at the time, maybe the key moment comes in 2019, on 10th of October 2019, and that deal between Johnson and Varadkar, which in a sense was a kind of devolutionary deal. It replayed many of the politics over the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement, and the idea of putting in place a consent mechanism in order to have a form of sea border. For Johnson to betray all the things that he had said and that May had said at that point, from our perspective, that looks very dramatic, and it looks like something that's very hard to reconcile as a unionist to your Britishness. It's very hard to see how those two things are held together. And if Johnson doesn't represent your Britishness at that point, then where is it? Where do you find the substance of it beyond that betrayal?
Yes, very, very important. Again, let me back into the question by giving you a little bit of history in this. I'm somebody who was sympathetic to Brexit when the concept was, before the word term has existed. I think it was about a decade ago. It was about 2012, 2013. I thought the cultural gulf between the UK and the EU was too great and it needed to go alone. I interviewed everybody who came into Northern Ireland, including Boris Johnson, everybody. David Cameron, except Theresa May, funnily enough. I was the only person I wasn't able to interview, pro and both sides of the argument. And everyone who was anyone who came in, I interviewed them. And by then I was absolutely clear that it would be a disaster for unionism to leave. I wrote an article on Saturday before, this could blow the UK apart. So I'm actually relieved it hasn't blown the UK apart. I'm relieved that the movement against unionism and against being in the UK has been so small. I think it's about 4% of my reading of the polls overall. It's a real phenomenon, but it hasn't been. So unionists have got away with it in a way. But in terms of the betrayal, okay, so yes, this is again something unionists need to be mindful of, point A, work on point B, and pragmatic about point C. So by which I mean this, you're really stupid, and this is complacency, if you don't realize there's a peril to the unionist position in what could best be called the indifference of people. I mean, we're talking in Boris Johnson's respect of a ruthless man who had much less interest in the well-being of the union than Theresa May did, even though I think she was very flawed in how she approached it all. So you have to be aware of that. The other thing is you don't get gloomy about it and don't accept the taunting Sinn Féin line of, oh, game is up and nobody cares. There's actually some surveys that show a slight increase. There was a recent one that didn't, but in terms of support for Northern Ireland staying in the UK. And one thing's really changed. From the 1990s, you couldn't get Northern Ireland, stupid Northern Ireland having different banknotes, but it does. You couldn't get them accepted in England, much more likely to be accepted now. So these are not necessarily, there's a large number of people who don't care. There's a small, in England, Scotland and Wales, there's a small number who are quite firmly supportive of Northern Ireland being in, and a very small number who are actively hostile. So you have to be aware of the precariousness of that. And then you've got to do something, and I'll just end on this point. This thing is, and we as a newspaper have almost campaigned against it, this joining with Sinn Féin, who want Northern Ireland to fail as an entity, which they're entitled to do. Of course they want it to fail. In always complaining about the lavish generosity, no acknowledgement of the phenomenal generosity of the UK Treasury towards Northern Ireland. Just none. From unionists, virtually none. And I mean, if anything is playing with fire and getting people to go, well, I can't be bothered with this anymore. I think of a wealthy friend of mine in London who's for a long time been annoyed at the taxes he pays and the Scottish ingratitude. And I noticed that people like that beginning to, after the DUP deal, coming onto their radar, wait a minute, the Northern Irish, they've got a chip in their shoulder too. That's dumb if you can't see that.
So putting all that together, and also you talked about the complacency of the Protestant state, we might say, and in its early years. What is making devolution work the solution? And we're kind of at that stage now, and we can see that some of the issues around the economics of Northern Ireland are beginning to come into play a little bit in the budgetary arrangements. The UK wants Northern Ireland to function in a slightly more efficient way, let's say, and that hides a lot of ills. But what's the future for an effective unionism? Is it making Northern Ireland work? Is it making people believe that Britishness is a kind of viable future concept? Is it forward-looking? Is it of the now, or is it backward-looking? Or how does unionism bring together all these strands that you've been talking about?
These are very challenging questions because you really, really hit on one that I'm very uncertain about. I think there's profound problems with devolution leading to the breakup of the UK. I'm really worried about it. Just as a sort of self-perpetuating mechanism of making people think apart. And by the way, can I just say a word of the you never hear about? You hear about British misdeeds over the century. What about the generosity? What about the gentle way it dealt with 30 years of IRA-led terrorism? And it was IRA-led, by far the biggest in number. They tried all sorts of different tactics, all of which failed. No other state in the world would have responded so gently to that. Barely ever killing senior IRA people. Made a lot of blunders in the beginning. Never hear about that. But also the generosity. The generosity of the British saying to the Scottish and the Northern Irish, 50% plus one and you can go. By goodness, the Spanish don't say that. By goodness, the French don't say that. By goodness, the Italians don't say that. America doesn't even have a mechanism for the state to leave in its very impressive constitution. Generous, gentle Britain, 50% plus one, you can go. So that presents a difficulty for us. Why do I have difficulty in answering your question? That makes me worried about devolution. Another thing I'd say just in passing about my generation, born in 1971, happened that my parents come back in 74. By the way, the answer to the question when I said, why did you come back then, but we thought it was all solved because of Sunningdale. Sunningdale hadn't yet collapsed. They'd probably accepted the job in early 74. And then, then get my fantasy answer. Again, I was talking about the Act of Union maybe having been a success by mistake. The British normalization policy in Northern Ireland is a huge success. And my generation sees it up close. Why? My school year is people born from September 71 to August 72. And therefore, you start to, one of my earliest memories is in 75 of my dad going into the Royal Victoria Hospital. And I know it's 75 because he moved office from that hospital later that year through an army checkpoint when I was, 3, 4, coming up to 4. And I always remember it. And it's very exciting to a boy, soldiers and stuff. And so we see the normalization. And the idea, I was reading an article about English people being clueless, about Princess Diana after she died or something, talking about her having gone to the height of the Troubles. It was talking about the 1990s. She'd walked around Belfast, the height of the Troubles. So the normalization by then was almost total. So 71, 72 is chaos. My generation's beginning to notice the opening of Belfast, central to which is the opening of the Opera House in 1980 when I was coming up to 8, coming up to 9. And restaurants start to appear in the 80s. So what did they do? They knew not to overreact, UK governments, Labour and Tory, to terrorism. Knew not to shoot terrorists on the whole and cause backlash and create martyrs. And gradually Belfast gets better and better and better. And for me, the unionist nirvana peaks in October 1985. Prior to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, because that was the closest you got to a really good direct rule plugged into the country. People are pretty happy. Violence is very low in 85. And then there's a November 85, back to your point about, I don't like to use these emotive words like betrayal, but the Anglo-Irish Agreement was a really, it was the seminal, possibly of the last century. Brexit, I can go back and forth in my own head on this. It's a seminal disaster for unionists, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And now that we have to have devolution, I'm not sure what the way to respond to it is. I've thought through in my head, could unionists go into opposition and maybe start to win over the centre ground? But then I think that probably lead to marginalisation. It's a hell of a problem. And you have this party that has to be duplicated at all times, treated by different rules. Sinn Féin, that doesn't want Northern Ireland to work, was allowed to bring Stormont down in 2017. And remember that when Sinn Féin brings something down, nothing returns till Sinn Féin gets what it wants. Unionists, more recent, did not get what they wanted. It's amazing it was tolerated. So that's a really big problem for unionists. And how to respond to that, I'm not sure. I'm making a partisan point there on unionists to make a less partisan point, because many people listening to this will disagree with what I just said radically. How can you have Sinn Féin and DUP in power at all times? How can you have Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in power at all times, or Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage? I've never found an Irish analogy for that, for those extremes, because you've amazingly still sort of non-distinct extremes. But that's a fundamentally dysfunctional system.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So I think I want to leave lots of time for questions. I think we've kind of come up to the present day, but it's been wonderful, Ben. Thank you. And I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I think we have a mic. If you're going to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind saying your name and any affiliation that you have. So the first question down here.
Yeah, it's such a great question. My parents both went to Queen's, and so many of their friends did. Partly that was because, the way back, and, it's not as easy to move around anywhere. I think that the brain drain's been a really big problem, but it's not just the brain drain. I mean, it's really painfully exposed by Brexit. I mean, the cluelessness and the lack of bandwidth. And I often say about Brexit that my understanding of Brexit probably is in the top 1% of the population, and I'm one step up from clueless. And the reason I say that is I've been following, as I said, interviewing everybody who's anyone before they came in, and when you get into the detail of it, always turning around looking for a trade expert to phone, or somebody else who knows more. That's how complicated it is. So that's a defense of unionism is very complicated, but really it's been hopelessly ill prepared for this. And then there's also a stigma. By the way, another thing I should very briefly say, I went into unionist commentary. I've always admired journalists. You never know what they think. The David Dimblebees, the whatever, the greats. I just love that. A journalist, you don't know how this person would vote. And I made a conscious decision 10 years or so ago when I was deputy editor to go into unionist commentary because I felt unionists needed help. And because of the disgraceful failure to defend your own community. And really brought apparent by the Troubles. And I may have upset some of you when I did my defense of the security forces there. Where are these people? Where are they challenging the lies of terrorists, citing elementary statistics about what really happened on the border, and the bombing and the murder and mayhem and the attempt of IRA to try every tactic, bombing London failed, shooting isolated security force members in Fermanagh places. 90% plus of Troubles killings in Fermanagh are IRA. Where are they to challenge any of this? So there is both a going away, the brightest and best, very, very big problem for this island. Still, I mean, look at isn't Oxford still? Richardson, is she Oxford or Cambridge, or an Irish woman, the head, and then in an additional layer of reluctance to defend anything unionist, and business with a long tradition of industry and Protestants and farmers and stuff. And after that, no one wouldn't say a word, barely anybody, against the Irish Sea border. So thanks. And I would say, in very short answer to that, yes, it does need to be engendered. How on earth you do that, I don't know, because that's a really big question. What I would say is that I'm friendly with a guy, who's a few decades older than me, and has a much longer reference point before the Troubles, which I don't have. And he talked about, in a way that he would be critical of unionist complacency, how unionists dominated everything in the 1960s, and the legal and academic and the whole thing, and now it's just gone the other way. How do these things happen? Don't know. I mean, one of the things is because I think discrimination is grossly exaggerated, but there was discrimination, and it must have been awful if you lost out to a job because some buffoon in the Orange Order got it. Obviously, did happen, and the resentment that comes, and then you have a community that pushes itself up massively, thanks to grammar schools. Absolutely central, by the way, to the understanding of Northern Ireland is how the bright working classes in both sides, but the Catholic side, really take advantage of it rightly. How you engender it, I don't know, but you've gone from the most incredible seesaw flip from unionist complete dominance to unionist cluelessness and apathy. I think there'll be some rebound, because I think there's enough people who feel like I do that we're not going to run around and keep saying sorry and accept these distortions. But I did think the Troubles would do it. I thought, well, wait till you see. We get soldiers in the dock when IRA men can operate freely here, and there's no chance that any of the various, I won't list the names, IRA Army Council guys who died in recent years. No chance they would ever have been prosecuted. Absolutely out of the question. Wouldn't have allowed it. UK whole system wouldn't have allowed it. Which understandable, by the way. If you have a peace deal, you can't start banging people up in prison. But then I thought, wait till you see the discrepancy. And then the first soldier was actually convicted last year, and no backlash at all. So if that's not producing a backlash and getting people to sort of, and I don't mean a nasty backlash, I'm not talking about protests in the streets, I'm talking about people saying we need to get our act together and defend some of these things. If that's not doing it, what will?
And the question in a way was some, no, it's interesting because I think that question of civic unionism, I think back to the 1990s and people like Norman Porter and Robert McCartney were effectively proposing a kind of civic unionism, which was partly, it recognised faith, for example, as part of the unionist identity, but it didn't put it front and centre. And to some extent, it was about values, I suppose. Now, whether it was realistic or not, I don't know. But in many of the things that you said, I mean, you were talking about a kind of form of unionism that values the monarchy, but monarchism and what it represents isn't necessarily central to the way you see unionism and that idea of Britishness. It's kind of based around a set of values, which I think we can infer and take from what you've said. So I'm curious about it in a more positive kind of way. Do you see all the elements that you've talked about, and partly in your life and what you believe in the analysis that you undertake, that there is a kind of form of civic unionism that our questioner has raised, which is a feasible future position, and it might actually be a different political position than is taken by the two current three current parties.
I hope it might not. I sort of went off on a tangent in legacy. I hope it might not have seemed like I wasn't answering your question. It's really difficult, and I don't know how this comes about. What I would say is that some of the things that I've said I've come to like about Britain is the casualness and my concern. Actually, I worry about this for Western civilization. If you're not going to defend yourselves at all, guys, and civilizations can collapse pretty quickly. So these are Northern Ireland's a microcosm of that. On the other hand, I think, well, actually, it's pretty good at enduring. So here's a thing that's happened. The first is the IRA and all its different tactics, and I didn't only cited some of them, by the way, ultimately including trying to kill people who supplied the security forces. That was very unpleasant. And I know very well a businessman who was killed for doing just that. Really dreadful. They just weren't able to do what Brexit has done. What could they do to disrupt internal trade? Even if they'd blown up boats in the middle of the Irish Sea, what would have done? Just a few boats would have been blown up, but wouldn't have done it. So actually, Brexit did something the IRA wasn't capable of doing. And I've had a real insight into how lucky we were, because we had the status quo. And if you have a comfortable status quo, you can't get people against it. And now, unionists, partly stupidity, have, and as I said, I'm not sneering at Brexit overall because there's something to be said for sure. Now the status quo is this new arrangement. And those of us who are opposed to it have had very little success in getting people agitated about it. That doesn't answer your question, but what flows from status quos and comfort is maybe things like civic involvement. So there was a very complacent, to use the word again, unionist school of thought that you sat out this government, didn't do a deal to return Stormont, and Labour would deal with Labour from scratch. Now, the historical precedent shows why that exists, which is that it's the party that sees itself as unionist more likely to suddenly turn against it, as happened in the suspension of Stormont in 72, Anglo-Irish Agreement 85, and Irish Sea Border, the Conservative and Unionist Party. Now, the complacent view would appear to be vindicated by the selection of Hilary Benn as Shadow Secretary, because he's had the wit, I would say from a unionist perspective, not to say anything Irish nationalistic or so on. He's not going to rock the boat for Keir Starmer by opening up Northern Ireland. But I think unionists have to be aware of the fact that you're dealing with a party where a Secretary of State at any moment could change. While they didn't do anything that was fundamentally anti-unionist in their previous spells in power, there are a lot of people in the party who are hostile to Northern Ireland and the Union still, and they might well be reliant on SNP votes. And I come back to something I said. A decade ago, Unionists weren't that interested in the Scottish vote, so they should be more aware of these perils. Thank you. Really great question. Newspapers are on life support. Simple as that. Won't bore you all with statistics. In many respects, I didn't think I'd be here 10 years ago, and was thinking of exit strategies. So it hasn't been quite as rapid a decline, but the circulations are bad, really, across the board. Two biggest selling in the UK, Daily Mail and The Sun, are in the 700,000 mark and falling at 15%. That's 600-something thousand next year, 500-something thousand next year. Two of the best selling papers in the English-speaking world, and that's all they've got, let alone regional papers. So that's really problematic. So that's you're asking about influence. I would argue that the Irish News is an excellent newspaper, by the way. We do get very much criticism, the Unionist, for we're accused of being, blinkered and so on. What I have tried to do in my influence in the paper, which predates me being editor to some degree, we have become more unionist because the union is in a more dangerous situation. But we have, and this is so central to me and so important to newspaper, we have been nobody's dupe. We had a great political editor, Sam McBride, who destroyed the DUP over cash for ash. I wasn't the editor then, by the way, but I fully supported his coverage. No intent, not because I was wanting him to destroy the DUP. They just happened to be most implicated in it, not the only people implicated in it, but because if you're going to do something as rotten as handle public money in a disgraceful way, at best supreme incompetence, there are all sorts of reasons, nothing to do with unionism and otherwise, why you have to expose that. And incidentally, if you are a unionist, my earlier point about showing gratitude for UK money. So newspapers are very, very important in that we do that, and if we weren't around, that kind of thing wouldn't be done. Where they're going, massive rises in digital. The John Bruton essay, people were reading it for 4 minutes. That's very, very long. For some people read a weather report, and you can watch how long somebody has spent on an article. The average might be 12 seconds. So it's a very exciting time, but how on earth we're going to make proper money out of it at the sub-New York Times, Economist, Financial Times elite, where they can make a fortune on digital. How the rest of us are going to make enough money to survive, I don't yet know, but we will. And I think it's getting young people to realize they have to pay for things, which they will, because the young people become older people and they start to have a bit of money. But it's a big, big problem. Yeah, great. Thanks. So important as well, that question. I'll answer it in the following way. A unionist councillor got angry with me, positively angry at the Ulster Unionist Conference, because I've been talking about legacy a long time. Well, better part of 10 years, I've been quite troubled by it. And he said, and he confronted me and said, you're bringing back the past and alienating people and so on and so forth. My answer to that is this is just inescapable, what the IRA is up to. The IRA and their mates are up to. And their many mates, their influential mates are up to. And it's really moving very, very quickly. I talked about UA up the Ra. What do we do about that? I don't think we can ignore it. It just means complete victory for the IRA narrative. That the UK was a murderous state, loyalist murderous state, and the IRA were freedom fighters. That's a catastrophe if that narrative becomes embedded, which I fear it will. How do we do that? Yeah. really difficult to be simultaneous. I mean, one thing I would say about the newsletters, we're so positive about Northern Ireland. I'm just so delighted to have a front page about something else, or about a rock star coming in, or things that young people are interested in, or the vibrancy or hotel rates, or cruise ships, the biggest ever cruise ships coming in, and all that kind of stuff that's going on. And I write a lot about infrastructure. I love using Dublin Airport because we've been imbeciles. If you want to see Northern Ireland, all things to all men, we've got 3 airports, and you've got a mega airport in Dublin, which there's a motorway to the door. So it isn't all negativity. It's a lot of other stuff. But yes, in short answer to your question, I realize the problem with that. And it's another one I'm navigating in my head. Yeah, again, these are great questions. Unexpected things happen. COVID, curiously, might have helped the UK. I don't want to be flippant about it, but made people think about the NHS and stuff. It's really difficult how we're going to do that and continue to fight an onslaught. There's an onslaught going on. It's a very, very big challenge. It has to be a comfortable, prosperous place, which I think Northern Ireland is. And it has to be a dual approach, as I was saying. Because of the UK generosity to the point of foolhardiness of that's it. I mean, the UK's lost control of what happens to a degree. I mean, the only control, how wonderful that Hilary Benn is not saying they need to clarify the criteria for a border pool. What? Clarify the criteria for a border pool? I mean, it's already pretty clear, and that's just almost some foolish unionists are almost agreeing to that. John Major, regrettably, a very distinguished man, agreed to that. The only thing it has is a degree of discretion on calling a border poll, and so it's really, really important that we work to avoid that happening. And I have always felt and long believed in, very hard to answer your question, and I'm not able to give a great answer to it, if I'm to be honest, because of this battle that needs to happen at the same time. But I was always an advocate of the decoupling of conscience issues, where there's been an avalanche. I mean, if you have South America 10 years ago supporting same-sex marriage, once very Catholic South America, most of it. I mean, you have a revolution that was never going to avoid Northern Ireland. I mean, the most hostile place in the entire United States to same-sex marriage was Mississippi. And even Mississippi was something like, I had the statistics once, 59% opposed, as opposed to 97% opposed. So I always felt that unionists should be not seem mean. And maybe unionists should leave people like me to get annoyed about legacy and have nicer people talking about other things. But it's a very big question, and it's something we really need to think about.
I have one last question for you, Ben, which is in your journalist mode rather than your personal mode, which is about your take on the future of the unionist parties. Obviously, we're at a very strange moment in time, and with the disappearance of Jeffrey Donaldson, we might think there would be a realignment opportunity, I suppose, or an inevitability within the 3 unionist parties. What's your own take? I know it's very hard to say what's going to happen, but are there fissures there that have been bubbling up through Brexit that might eventually play out in a couple of years in a realignment in the party system?
I'll loop this back to school. In 1985, just before the Anglo-Irish Agreement, actually, I think it was that period in 85 that I thought was a golden period. Jim Molyneux, the Ulster Unionist leader, was asked by our school magazine, an older boy interviewed him, should there be one unionist party? That's when the UUP and DUP. Do you know what he said? He said, no, because if there was one unionist party, there would be 3. The Liberals would leave the UUP and the hardliners would leave the DUP. Never forgotten that. Prescient. We now have three. And why do you not have the obvious merger that there should be between the Ulster Unionists and the DUP? Because they're indistinguishable, many of them. Now, while you don't for historical reasons, there's still a lot of resentment about what Jeffrey Donaldson and Arlene Foster did to David Trimble. These things don't go away very easily. You also have unionist confusion, where unionists are sort of taking liberalism really far to almost not being unionists. And then you have, so what I think is a natural division into two. There has to be a progressive, moderate unionist body, and there has to be a unionist body that says, no, we're actually not agreeing to this, and no, we're not agreeing to that, but we might be positive about this. So that's the difficulty. Back to your point about seeming always to say no. I think there needs to be a natural division into two. Last thing I'd say, when I joined the newsletter in 2007, 17 years ago, almost to the month actually, there was a big clamour for unionist unity. And there's now a realization that unionist unity will be a sort of flag-waving, potentially monolith that puts people off and I think will become financially potentially corrupt or smug and won't have enough dissent in it. So I don't know what the future shape of unionism is, but I think it's going to need to involve at least, well, it can't be more than two, but it needs to be two entities.
Ben, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today and fascinating as always to get your perspective on things. So if you could join me in thanking Ben.